I have to start by saying it is such an honor for me to have this conversation with the great name nourbeSe Philippe about her work in poetry and about the many iterations and translations and back and forth around this work. Um, and I'm happy that we're having this discussion today because these discussions around translation, as you know, are very actual and are very important for all Caribbean texts in general, but specifically with this work, I think it exemplifies how issues of translation can carry so much more into them and such an important relationship with the work. So I want to start first by asking you, can you tell us about how you came about to write this important text?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Stéphane, for agreeing to participate in this. And I just want to give a couple of thank yous and shout outs to people who have worked with me on this whole thing for the last several months. Faisal, Dean, Marta, Fernandez Campo, Natasha, Ek, Zoe, Imani Sharp, Eli Moss, Tanya Foster, Elena Basile, and Diane Roberts, and many others. To answer your question, I first read about it in a book by a man called James Walvin, who is an English historian academic, and he made reference to this particular case. It's a well-known case around the circles of people who study slavery. I hadn't known anything about it, and I confess to being really shocked when I first heard about it. So he had a reference to the citation, Gregson versus Gilbert, and I photocopied the page and put it away in my filing cabinet, as I want to do, and thought, oh, I should go and look it up at some point. And I think some years later, I went down to the U of T library, found the case, the publication of the case reports, and found the case. And I still recall my shock when I saw it was nothing but 2 pages. Yes. I remember thinking, how can you, even though I had studied law, but how can you write about the murder of 150 people and it just be 2 pages, you know? Anyway, I photocopied it and took it home. And again, I was struck by the use of the word murder was mentioned only once. And I put it away again. Then I was applying for a grant and I thought I want to do something with this case. So that's how I first heard about it.
My God, I didn't realize that it was only a 2 pages.
Yeah, it's a 2-page case report. And, you know, the way I set about working on it, some in the audience might know the work. At some point, I decided I was going to lock myself in the text to find out, just because there was such a paucity of materials. And Martha, as you know, studying for law, what you're doing, you're reading a lot of cases, you know, over the 3 years, and you're reading them often sometimes as they go through the appeal system. So I had this conviction that all the stories were locked in that 2-page document. They had to be somehow. There are only about 500 plus different words in the 2 pages. So the first version, so
it wasn't very dense, is what you described. It was a very dense text.
It was a very dense text, but very typical of case reports. You know, they give the case history, and then they summarize the arguments of the lawyers who are making presentations, and then they give a little summary of what their decision is. Yeah, that was it. And because I had this process of reading all these cases, I thought the stories have to be locked in here somewhere. And so I first decided I would just use the words as they appeared in the case report. So the first section, os, they're only made up of the words that are in the case report. And then I kept having this desire to, what I call, Martha, you'll recognize this, break and enter the text. You know, yes. I wanted to carry out a break and entry. But because I had set myself the rule, I thought, but you can't break the rule. But I couldn't find any more poems if I was just using the words as they were. And then I had this idea about 2 years later that I would in fact break and enter the text by fragmenting each word in the text to find words inside those words.
Yes,
Like
yes,
when you play
absolutely.
Boggle. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that just generated a universe of these
Mm.
voices on board the ship. Yeah.
I love this idea of a behind the text.
Mm-hmm.
And when you describe it as locking yourself into the text and believing that there were locked stories inside of the text, having to break the words to find them,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it immediately describes the relationship that you had that you had with this text. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a relation of a peaceful approach of the text, and by any means, it was really something that you had to to grapple with, to find ways to enter it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's really interesting what you're asking there because, as I laughed when I said a break and entry. I mean, that's a
Mm.
criminal act.
That's a
The
criminal
law
act, yeah.
says it's a criminal act. So
Mhm.
so clearly I felt that there was something about about the law in the larger sense that was prohibiting me from entering this text. And I think we can tease that out in many different directions. But today is probably not the right time because of time
No, I
constraints.
think the choice of words is very important
Yeah,
actually, and I
yeah,
think it will come back to to what happened down the line with this text. I
yeah,
think
yeah,
something had to be broken in. Well, absolutely. I have a friend historian, Grace Sanders Johnson, who always talks about the archive and the relationship that she, as an African American, has to this archive, as having to read against the grain of the archive.
yes,
So her
absolutely.
description is, but your description is much more forceful in the sense
Yeah,
that you had to break in the
yeah.
text. How long did it take you? You're describing a very long process of writing. How
Yeah,
long did it take
it
you
was
to?
quite long, and I just want to add one more, I think, to what you said and about your friend. I think
Mm.
you said he talks about or she talks about reading against the grain, but
Yeah,
there's also a sense I have in that um, writings and texts and landscapes have traces of what's
Mhm.
happened, so that Gregson versus Gilbert, I could feel the traces, if you want, of the residues. One metaphor that I used is that it's as if I submerged the dry bones of that document into water, and the
Make them
dry material just sort of became full
alive
once
again.
again, alive
Hmm.
again. Yeah.
Hmm.
And in terms of the length of time, I was just looking today in preparation for this. I signed the contract in 2002 and the book was published in 2008, but I had to have
Mm.
sent them something before 2002. So I know it was at least 7 years I was working on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And why do you think that is? Why do you think it took you so much time to envision this work? Was it because you had to find these voices, or because that you had to find in yourself the capacity to give them words again, give them form again on the poetic page?
I think probably a combination of all those things, and not so much my finding the voices, but maybe letting the voices find me.
Yes.
Because language has always interested me. I speak English, but I talk about English being my mother tongue, my father tongue, a foreign anguish is English. I have a very difficult relationship, although I love the language. It's the only language I know. But I was saying just the other day, it's like having an abusive parent. You don't stop loving them because they've abused you in a very bizarre way. And
Yeah.
and English does work like that. So I'm always very conscious of English. I think I don't know. I think I was responding to the gravity of the work. Do you know?
Yeah.
To think. I remember what I took into the text was into writing it was how to make meaning. I think that's what we do as humans. It's really fundamental. We're always trying to make meaning, whether you're religious, spiritual, secular. In
Hmm.
some cases, it's, oh, I didn't have my coffee this morning. That's why I was, or I
Hmm.
had too much coffee last night. That's on the most superficial level, not for
Hmm.
coffee drinkers. But more seriously, how do you make meaning of these events like this, like
Yes. Yes.
you
Hmm. Hmm.
throw overboard? And
100%.
our history, unfortunately, I mean the world, is replete with those kinds of situations. Is it God's will? Is it just, um, well, shit happens, do you know?
Well,
And so,
yes, of course it does, and it keeps happening, but it has an unlimited imagination about that.
yeah, yeah.
But when you describe your process as finding this residual voice, these residual voices, these residual presence, there is a spectral quality to what you're describing of almost a ghostly, haunting of this text that is not meant to give these voices present, but yet you could still find or have access to them, I have to say,
Mm-hmm,
behind the text.
mm-hmm.
That's really important, I think.
Yeah, I think that's important. And earlier this week, I had a discussion with some young artists, and the same word came up, haunting. And one of the things I say, though, when I think of the word haunting, it has maybe because the way it's been articulated in popular Hollywood culture,
Yes,
it's always
okay.
something negative and frightening. I don't think
Mm,
of it so much as haunting. I prefer spectral. I prefer
spectrality. Hmm.
um, thinking of it in terms of this leaving of traces and how can we become more sensitive to what has been left behind. How do we read even landscapes and so
Hmm.
on, where one of the things I've said in another context is that we inhabit forensic landscapes
Hmm.
here in Canada. Great crimes have been committed here.
Yes.
And how do
Hmm.
we inhabit those landscapes? In some instances, there is definitely a haunting because
Yes. Hmm.
it hasn't been a resolution. I think, Stefan, um, what is what is happening is I use the word resolution, maybe a sort of completing of the circle with Zong. I was talking to a young PhD student yesterday, and she works on temporality. And one of the things I was saying to her, it occurred to me in the moment that we think of time as past, present, future. So we're in the now, but there's a
Hmm.
sense in which I think when I work with Zong and when I was working with it, writing it, and now when I read it, that because the text is set up in a particular way, that we are throwing our voices to the then, to the past. But then we now um, are actually that future back then.
Yes.
So we
Yes.
throw it
Yes.
to them, they throw
Hmm.
it back to us.
Hmm.
And there's some sort of, I'm making this gesture because I feel
Yes.
that's what happens when we do the readings. There's something
Hmm.
moves through us and it's settled. And I think that I think one aspect of the work that we're all engaged in terms of justice work, whether it be legal stuff or writing, translation, is trying to bring some sort of resolution in that sense so that the haunting isn't there, but it doesn't mean the voices go
The
away
voices are not
necessarily.
there
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
I was going to ask you about the readings because I think the quality of one of the many qualities of this text is that it calls for almost like a voice itself. It calls for performance, and it calls for to be read and read and read again, almost like almost like a new ceremony, almost like something that has to be actualized all the time. So in a way, and my question is, in a way, do you think that this text will go on like that, never being completely finished, but always calling for one more iteration, one more performance of it?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question because what I have said is that Zong is unfinished. Even the
Yes.
written text is unfinished, and I don't think it will ever be finished. And it can be, in a way, rewritten in different ways depending on who is doing the reading and how the reading is being done and so on. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so there is that quality of being unfinished, but not in the negative sense, in the sense that we're all
No,
unfinished, do you know?
and a sense of something that is alive and that has to grow. And
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
that's really beautiful.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
How were the initial conversations with your editor? How did you find each other, or how did that go?
So yeah, we're getting into some of the difficult parts of this. So I received a letter from Wesleyan many years ago after I published She Tries Her Tongue, telling me that, asking me if I would send them my next work. They wanted to see it. And it took me 10 years before I had something to send to them. And what I sent to them was Zong. And we had a, you know, I would say we had a pretty good relationship. For instance, the first issue when we were in production, Zong was put into a fairly a narrower edition than you see. It was long and narrow, and I remember saying to her, well, not to her and to the person who was doing the production, you know, the text needs to breathe. So from way back then, this idea of breath was a part of it.
Was
And
a central issue.
it was a central issue, although I know I wasn't as knowledgeable about what the text is doing around breath then as I am now, but I knew that it felt constrained because I really very much wanted it to be an alternative to the hold. You know, the hold that Glissant, the abyss that Glissant talks about, that compresses you. I wanted this text to expand and breathe. And so without any hassles, they redid it. And you know, a couple mornings ago, I was lying in bed and sort of thinking how much I like this edition of Zong. It's such a beautiful edition. The paper, the weight of the paper, the words, the cover of the book. It was really quite lovely.
Your answer has me asking a lot of questions. The first one is, were you immediately aware, or how aware were you through the years of the importance of the breathing in the text?
Well,
Did you write it initially
yeah,
as is on the
yeah,
page, or
yeah.
okay?
What I meant by saying that I feel like I know a lot more now after,
Yes.
you know, 12 years of readings and so on. But if you look at Notanda, it's stated there very clearly that the words are positioned in such a way that no fragment, word, or group of words can come directly under another. They have to be breathing into the space above. And that to me, back then, was linked to the people who were thrown overboard. That the words and the text were performing for them what they couldn't do. They couldn't breathe, they drowned. And so when we read this text, we actually, and this is what I mean by I feel much more strongly about this, I'm much more affirmed in it. We're actually breathing for them in that moment and allowing them to do whatever needs to be done. And that is non-negotiable. And I was very clear about that. And there was no problem with them in printing it the way it was, the way I set it up. Yeah. And I mentioned that in the Notanda. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very important and
And on the
interesting.
cover of the book, it also advertises it because it says, as told to the author by Sitege Boateng. So right away there, and I talk about feeling that I was the unauthor, so to speak. I was almost a sort of conduit through which something was coming. Yeah.
And were you made more aware through the readings of the importance of this action of breathing between the words, or breathing the words onto the poem?
I don't know if
Who were the initial performers of that text?
Oh, myself and whoever was willing to come and be there. My daughter, friends, you know, they were very small, a small group of people, and it never is a large group, but just people who know about it and who come. And I think I have become more aware of how the text, one of the things I say when I perform the text, I'm not performing it, the text is performing me. And I think that is what happens with other people as well. And you know, that point I made about the positioning, that is the crux of the issue with the translation, because they did not respect that. And if I could just take a little time,
yes, absolutely. I was going to ask you about the conflicts that emerged around this work.
But this morning I was looking at many things, and they sent this to this. They sent me the congratulations on June 11th last year, 2016. The translator writes to me, says, "I'm interested in translating this." No, she didn't have a contract, didn't have a publisher. I've started to translate it. Are you interested in looking at it? And I didn't. I put her in touch with the publishers. I said,
Of course,
you have to have permission
of
to
course.
translate it.
Hmm.
I never heard from her again until last year. So that's 5 years. In June 11th, the publishers wrote to me congratulating me on the publication of Zong. And I initially write back, I was quite happy, although I didn't know anything about it. The publishers, Wesleyan, had not said anything to me. But then when I sat and looked at it, I was actually quite devastated. So I just want to read a little thing here.
Yes, please.
On June 15th, I write to them. I once again wish to thank you for the efforts you have made translating Zong and acknowledge that it has been a long journey for you all. I have now had an opportunity to look at the translated text, and I regret to say that I'm extremely unhappy with it. I wish that somewhere along this long journey that you took, you had thought to talk to me. I wish Susanna Taminen, a publisher at Wesleyan, had had the courtesy to let me know that you had approached her so that I could have been in touch with you. Now, it's really interesting. They write back to me, but here is an important paragraph that Benway, the publishers, write to me. You are entirely right to say that we, Benway Series, and the translator should have contacted you earlier. But please be aware that although the project has been ongoing since at least 2016, the great bulk of the translation, the editing, and the painstaking proofreading of your book was essentially done during the pandemic, among great personal and professional difficulties, and on a very tight schedule. We hope that we can count on your understanding and that you will accept our heartfelt apologies.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I wanted to share that with you and both in the audience is just to show that when I get to the point of calling for the book to be destroyed, it is after weeks, months of pleading with them to hear what I'm saying about why this organizational principle is so important. It is reparative, it is recuperative, and it has meaning for us as African descended people, particularly those descended from the transatlantic.
I think it's so important that you told us the importance of the breathing and of the word positioning on the page for this poem, for this work, and that is exactly the aspect that was not seen by the translator or the
Yeah,
editor of the translation.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I say to them here in the same letter, the most important activity happening in Zong are the silences on the page, not the words. The central and organizing principle around which the words are laid out in the sections that follow os is that no word or word cluster can come directly below another, thereby allowing them to breathe into the space above. In seeking the breath in the space above, the words echo the actions of those who were thrown overboard the slave ship Zong. They also resonate with the long struggle of Africans to find the breath and space of freedom, from the Maroons running from enslavement to George Floyd, whose last words were, "I can't breathe." I repeat, the most important activity are the silences which are filled with the unknown and unknowing. And no one, they would not listen to me. Not them, not the translator, not the publisher.
No, but I think it's so important. It's this is the reason why I started with this long prologue, because I know our discussion is about mainly translation and rights around translation and publishing. But I think the backstory, if you will, of your text is so important to understand the issues at play here.
It's most
And I
important.
think, and we'll discuss legally what all this means. And I think it's important to see that a text that emerged from a legal document is generating now legal issues
Yeah, yeah,
around its publishing. I think
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
terrible irony in
yeah,
this. But the fact that it is precisely the foundational material of your text,
yeah.
meaning the breathing, the something that is behind the words that the publisher could not see because they were not in conversation with you.
Yeah.
So when you describe your text, you said it was founded by trying to go behind the words.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it's almost like the publisher was in front of the words, but could not see this behind that you're referring to.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Stéphane. Yeah, that's really
Mm.
beautifully put. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I have one question about, the about positionality, because I think positionality is also an important matter to discuss around your work, your writing, and then the issues around translations. I think maybe now we have to think about translation in a way that allows us to also think about positionality in the same time. I think you cannot maybe, tackle a translation project, especially a translation project around, big issues like not only the Black experience around the Americas, around the slave trade, but I think any work around, issues of genocide, issues of mass murder, issues, of great inequality, you cannot think of translating such text without thinking about your own positionality and questioning what that position does to the work. I don't know if you have ideas around this issue.
Yeah, I think it's a really complex issue, and of course it touches on issues of appropriation and who can translate and who can write. And I've always been of the view, and I've argued that I'm not someone, I don't believe in prohibitions, particularly when it comes to art.
I
I
agree.
really don't.
I
I
agree.
also come from a hybrid culture, Trinidad and Tobago, where you live cheek by jowl with South Asian people, Chinese people, the Portuguese, the Syrian, and there's a lot of movement of inspiration. You have choka chutney and chutney soka and all those kinds of things. So, and if we come to Zong, it becomes really even more interesting and complex because you remember that the voice that we're hearing in this text is a white male voice who is telling this story
Yes.
and yet somehow is able to reveal what is happening. So I hesitate, and that really upset me when the Benway and I don't know if the translator was part of it, but Benway series suggested and said that I was opposed to this because the translator was white. My work has been translated before. She Tries Her Tongue by a Spanish person into Spanish and Harriet's Daughter into German. That's not the issue. I think there are more preliminary, profound issues, which is
Yes.
Zong is already a translation. And I think that, we've had several discussions last year, and if my friend is on, he'll probably hear me saying this, Faisal Dean, wonderful thinker and scholar, who
Hello,
maintains
Faisal.
that Zong cannot be translated. Yes. And he knows that I am not of the view there yet. What I think is interesting, though, is that I think the mistake that these translators made, they looked at the graphic aspect of the work, and that was what they were trying to replicate. They didn't understand that underneath that, there was, to use Faisal's expression, a spiritual architecture in the work. Now, what it means is that if it's translated into another language, it might not necessarily look like it looks in English, right?
Yes, right,
But
right,
that
right.
central rule must be acknowledged, must be followed. You must allow breath to happen. So if you have
That's
to
so
break a
important.
Portuguese word or a French word, I don't know those languages well enough to know how that would happen. But so I think it's while I think what you're raising is really important. I think in terms of Zong, like there's some other issues that have to be looked at as well. Can someone from Europe translate this text? I don't know. We'd have to. I'm not interested in saying no. It must only be someone.
Yeah.
Must it only be someone female? I don't know. Could a man translate it? A Black man? I don't know. Because
Well,
there's a lot going on there around women on board the ship and so
Yes.
on, the women who wait and so on. So I think we have to, I don't want to put a cut and dried response to that. I prefer to sort of look at some of the other issues that are kind of shaking us up.
I really appreciate the nuance of your response, because it allows us to see what the true issues were around this translation. And I love really the terminology of spiritual architecture that Faisal has suggested to you. I think the important thing around translating such works is the ability to, even as a person of European descent, or a male, or whatever your position is, what is at play is your ability to see the work outside of these positionalities and power.
Absolutely.
You may be whatever your identity is, but if you cannot see outside of this identity to adopt the profound intent and meaning of the text, and to be able to see this behind the words, or see this spiritual architecture, you're missing something, because you're bringing back the work to what it was when you started your translation, meaning words on a page that enclose an experience around the sole perspective of the person perpetrating the crimes. Yeah, absolutely.
I think Martha has a hand.
Martha has a question. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, we can go on for I'm sure you have to leave.
I think that's a really opportune moment to ask a question, actually, if both of you, come to where we get to sort of one of the whole points, which is, at what point in the process of translation would the original poet should have had final approval over the translation?
Or say, at least.
Yeah, because when you think of a work in translation, there are, in fact, two copyrights. The translator is afforded a copyright in the translation in tandem with the original author. And so it raises that sort of question of, how do you contractually protect yourself in these situations? And in this instance, I think that one of the things that comes up is that when your publisher is at a remove, in another country, and they're in the business of granting licenses, and in this case for very, very little money, to another publisher, and then they're involved, but they don't actually have an obligation upon them to ensure the engagement with the author. So, it starts with that contract, and then it raises this sort of, ethical issues in translation more writ large, which are, what are the ethical obligations of translators to the original authors, and what do you do if there's a dispute?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question, Martha, because I think we talked about this before. The International Federation of Translators, their charter says that the translator is a secondary author and has to, quote unquote, accept special obligations with respect to the author of the original work. That was never done. And also, I said that Wesleyan was well within their rights. They had subsidiary rights. They had total control. They were within their rights to sell it to whomever. So when you raise the issue of the ethics of it, particularly with this kind of work that Chantal and I are talking about, what happens then? What is the dispute settlement? And the thing that we haven't mentioned is that the Canada Council also, you see, so everyone could sort of wash their hands, very much like the slave trade. Oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me, Wesleyan could say, the contract says so and so. The people at the Benway series said, oh, we negotiated with the publisher. That's fine. Canada Council just gave them $13,000 to do this publication, without which it couldn't happen. made no investigation as to what the rights of the author were and how he or she may have felt about it. So it's really a sort of chasing the tail of responsibility, ethical responsibility, round and round. Yeah. And dispute settlement, which, I mean, the reason why I took it to social media is because all my letters and trying to explain and beg them and plead with them to please understand this were just being dismissed, and dismissed in a really obnoxious way, I thought. I was told by one translator whom I knew in Italy, and she said, work like yours is very difficult. So almost like you should be grateful somebody is trying to translate it. That was one response. The publishers here, Wesleyan, said, they could put a note and then you'll get lots of reviews and the work will stay on readers' lists for a long time. And I thought, but that's not why I wrote this,
No,
so it was really contemptuous in lots and lots of ways. So finally I said I would take it to social media, which I really didn't want to do.
This is always the last resort.
Yeah.
Like things that you have to do to make the public aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
We've discussed this issue, Martha, a bit before the public conversation, and I've mentioned something that appears in a few of my contracts in French, because I work in the French-speaking industry, of the clause of the moral rights of the author.
Yeah.
I think it is so important because it's a clause that says basically that even though that the rights around the work have been ceded by the author, there is something that cannot be ceded. And that thing is the moral rights of the author around their own work.
Yeah.
They have to feel like whatever is done with the work, either an exhibition or a translation or an adaptation for cinema or TV, that it represents their work well. Not completely, but in a way that they can be comfortable with.
Yeah.
And it's probably pretty difficult to negotiate this in an official dispute, but I think it's important that it's mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, one of the conclusions that I've reached in my own reflections around this situation is that we should be advocating for the inclusion of moral rights provisions in these contracts with writers, particularly where their work, when you are, I mean, the subsidiary rights paragraphs are often standard, but there's no reason why we couldn't draft in language at a minimum that recognizes that there are moral rights in Canadian copyright law to which there needs to be attention. And there's particularly the rights of integrity. And the more I listen to you, nourbeSe, the more I'm just, this is about integrity. If the work needs to breathe, then it would be very difficult to translate. You think about a play having stage directions. In a sense, what you would need is notations to that effect, in a way. That's not outside the realm of the possible to seek from the person and to pay them for that. If that's the intent, if the intention is to be true to the intentions of the artist, then it should be possible to do that. And I do think there's a moral rights case here. I do think that there's it's arguable. The thing is, as I said, whenever we talk about moral rights cases, is that they're very difficult to mount because they require this high bar has been set from the Mike Snow case that the author's honor and reputation is going to be impacted, and for many artists, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, may not attain whatever it is that means to a court, right? That's the first thing. But then it occurs to me as I'm saying this, that there's another aspect of the integrity of the work, which is the positionality of the author in this instance, right? So it is that it is a work that is intended to be spoken from an African man through the ambit of Adamu Boateng, yeah? And so, and you know, this is a work of African literature, of you know, like there's all kinds of positions and you know, because it does really, it starts to fit very neatly in this idea of appropriation in the Indigenous art context. And the way that the United States Indian Arts and Crafts Act works, which is to address authenticity. And maybe that's taking it in a direction where you wouldn't want to go, but it does seem to me to be, it is fundamental to the integrity of the work that the author in this case is nourbeSe, who's positioned as a person of the Caribbean with the following descendant. I don't want to speak for you, nourbeSe, but I just think, like, yes, and I think you know, there's something to be said in the moment that we're in for acknowledging the honor and reputation of artists in their particularities, right? Like there's something very profound about this work, and perhaps it ought to be seen in this way, irrespective of how many damn copies it might have sold, you know?
Yeah. And also something that is implied in what nourbeSe said something a few minutes ago that is very important. What is implied by the you know, the phrasing of the translation, the translator is the secondary author. What is implied is that the author remains the primary author, meaning that the primary author has to be comfortable. And I don't think it's a lot to ask that the primary name on the cover, the primary author of a work, has to be comfortable with what ends up inside, even when translated, even when, you know, modified, because, you know, of course, Caribbean identities, as nourbeSe stated, are complex identities, and we wouldn't want to fixate anything in such ways that it cannot move anymore. And of course, works of art, poetry need to travel, and they need to have many iterations. And we had that conversation, obviously, of the importance of translation for Caribbean works, especially.
Yes, absolutely.
But at the end of the day, the work cannot do the opposite of what it's meant to do.
What it was intended to do, yeah.
Or what it was intended to do.
Yeah, yeah.
And ethically, there is something there, I think, that should be defended and argued.
Yeah.
For the work itself. Yeah.
And there is the other aspect of you know, it doesn't go to the issue of copywriters directly, but a number of arguments were made by the translator about there was an attempt to draw an equivalency between the transatlantic trade and what's happening in the Mediterranean. Therefore, Zong must be done because this work speaks to that. You know? And it very, very problematic argument. I don't think it's equivalent at all, although there are resonances and links between what's happening there and the transatlantic trade and so on. But there was that, you know, and so I am more interested in, and I said this to her in correspondence, working with people who maybe have experienced that crossing, the migrant crossing, or descendants, and having them begin to work on those stories rather than this very easy, facile, let's take this work from North America and apply it here. And then when there's pushback, then the author is accused of bringing North American approaches to the issue. I mean, it's like, again, it's being in this kind of house of mirrors that it just doesn't make sense, apart from the fact that what I've said is this, that it's very much an echo of the colonial strategy. I really feel that very strongly. And Italy, my understanding is Italy does not see itself as a colonial power in the same way that France and Spain and England see themselves, or try to see themselves, some of them, or struggling with seeing themselves. Is that probably more accurate? And so, so there is this, what I mean by the colonial strategy is that the colonials went into areas, Africa, Asia, they took the form, and it's in the email. We think our translation represents the graphic whatever of the text, and they leave behind as detritus the sort of spirit, this that animates those forms. So we get Picasso, we get the modernist movement, all those things that are based on African aesthetics. And I think this is I've written this, it's a move straight out of the colonial handbook, and all the responsibilities.
And it didn't have to be that way.
And it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And then the accompanying arrogance that suggests that you should be grateful that your work is being paid attention to.
Which is the standard response of just about everybody whenever you raise copyright, I might add. It's like, oh, aren't you just happy to have the work out there? And it's like, not always. First we like to get paid because somebody has to pay to make this, and second, and to feed the family, so to speak. But that's often very rarely the issue. Often the issue is, I want to know who's interested in my work. I want to have a conversation. I want respect. Yeah. And it's about the ethics of the exchange, because whenever you use another artist's work, whenever you touch another artist's work, artists want to have a conversation with you. I've yet to meet, in the years I've been doing this work, which is now almost 30, I've never met an artist who isn't first and foremost interested in the conversation that they're having with the reader,
of course,
with the audience, and when it comes, and it's so offensive to me that I have to listen to people go on and on and on about copyright is all about money and yada yada yada, and I'm like, no, actually, 90% of the time, it's not about the money. It's the only way we have. It's the only. That is the only hold that we have to say, actually, you can't do that without communicating with this person. So please, actually, take the time,
make the effort, and take the time.
It's
a different situation, because you mentioned Picasso, and however offensive you might think that is African-inspired art is, it still became a Picasso, which is not the case in a translation. I think this idea I've been struggling with between primary and secondary author is so important, because it still has to be your name, that defends whatever is done with your work in translation. It has to represent the work that you actually wrote and intended to do. So I think that's a different situation.
Absolutely. But I want to add something to what you're saying, Stéphane, which it just brings to mind. And I know you just tell us, Martha, when we have to, we should have had this for 2 hours, but what I want to say is that what you're saying is really interesting there, that last point, because what I found out was that Benway is a bilingual, Benway series. It's a bilingual series. Yes. There is only one other book that is only in Italian, a work by a former lawyer, he's now passed away, Charles Resnikov, about, I think it's called Holocaust. But there's an extensive explanation as to why they don't have the English version of that work. Zong is the only other work that only appears in Italian, and there is no explanation as to why the original version is not there.
This is why you need contract language that incorporates some of this in. And I'm grateful to you, Stéphane, for providing us with the...
Yes, I will send you the copy.
Because we that I think is going to be one of our projects over the summer. Perhaps we could engage in a conversation with the Canadian book publishers around this, and the possibility of incorporating it, because there are certain conventions in contract drafting. And, this isn't a big ask in actual fact, because in most cases, while I understand that, and I don't want to minimize the amount of work it is to translate any work or a work of poetry or otherwise, I think adding these things in is simply reminds everyone of things that sometimes we forget because we're all so busy and, and pandemic and life and all the things.
But if I may share, Martha, I wanted to share with the public the short excerpt from my contract that we were discussing. This is a contract with another editor, and I think the language of it is so beautiful. You can see at the beginning, I'll translate because it's in French, but it means like who has the right to the work. And the first article says that the editor will have will be able to do what they intend with the work, only in respecting the moral rights of the author, which cannot be ceded at any time. The author keeps these moral rights around their work. And I think it's not a very long article, but I think it's very important that it's placed at the beginning of all discussions around, ceding rights, and that it is stated that it cannot be ceded at any point. Yeah.
This, Martha, whatever you're doing around it, I think it's important that organizations like the Writers Union of Canada, because I use their contracts. I had to do a contract last year with some publishers in England, and I use their template quite a lot, trying to get things. And I think it'd be really important for them to change, if you do get, publishers agreeing to this, that they change their templates to include this.
And somebody in the chat also mentioned the Canada Council to be on board on such initiatives.
Because
well, that was me actually.
That was you.
But
as you're talking about the Canada Council, I thought, well, I'm obligated as a grantee. I have to make sure that we pay artists, and there's a lot of, and we also have to assure the council that we are respecting the copyright of artists.
Absolutely.
So if that provision is in, arguably that extends to moral rights. I'm like, in theory, the Canada Council could go back to Benway and say, it's come to our attention that you were not actually
diligent
diligent in this respect.
Absolutely.
And we have our money back. Which would they're not going to do that. But, I think getting that provision in, by the way, took years of artists saying, can you please make sure that our colleagues and presenters particularly, but not exclusively so, are conscious of how important these rights are to our work. And, there is a question that someone put in the chat, and I thought perhaps we could, I'll read it out to you. MB, thank you so much for this. I'm sorry this process has been so difficult. I was interested in your positions regarding the untranslatability of the text. You said a friend of yours thinks the book is untranslatable, and I understand the instinct, as in part shared with when reading the text and some pages of the translation. I would love to hear more from you about the possibility and desirability of translation for difficult texts like yours, and I'm using this term polemically. I hate that they use the richness and complexity of the text against you. Have there been other attempts at a translation in another language? Do you want this text to be translated? Finally, a last question. I often think of translation as allyship, in that it can have similar power, vocation, and pitfalls. Let me underline pitfalls. Does that resonate with you?
Let me take a stab at answering them. And perhaps Stéphane would like to talk about this too. No, there haven't been any other attempts at a translation in another language. I'll answer these more straightforward questions first. And do I want the text to be translated? I have postponed any thoughts about that until this matter is settled.
Of course.
In some way that I feel satisfied with it. Because, for instance, Martha, you were talking about, moral rights, and Stéphane as well. The first statement that Benway has up about me is really based on what they wrote to me. It's not true, They talk about the translator contacted the author and tried to involve her in the whole project. And they go on in that vein. The author said she was happy but never followed up the invitation to participate. This, I read to you what they said to me in their letters, that they acknowledged they should have been in touch with me. Yet this is the first paragraph that is put up there. And so until and unless they apologize for those things and it's settled in some way, I think that they take responsibility for what has happened, then I am not considering translations. Allyship, translation, it can have a similar power, vocation, and pitfalls. I haven't been involved with translation sufficiently. I've had 2 books translated, and I had really nothing much to do with them. Zong is a different process, and in terms of whether I think it can be translated, as I say, I am not of the view at this point that it can't possibly be translated. I have written in the notanda that the work is already a translation. It's a translation of the bones of the ancestors in an odd way. Does that mean it can't be further translated? I don't know at this point in time. But I am confident that I will get those answers. But it has to be done with respect if it's done. And as I said before, I realize that it's not going to look the same. As I say, Zong is unfinished. And I always felt that readers can come to the work, or writers maybe, with a different word store and find almost like other stories within the work. Because I am limited by what I know of the languages that I was bringing to the text. I studied French, Latin, and Spanish as a high school student, so I could bring that knowledge. I know a few words in different African languages, but someone might come with a whole other word store and find, more stories in there, which I think really amazing. So I think it's a very generative text, a fecund text in that respect. But I can't give an answer yea or nay at this point, apart from saying I'm not thinking of translation for the next little while. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Martha, your microphone is...
You do have the rights now to the work.
Yeah, I got the rights back
we should mention this. Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing to let people know, is that you now have, you advocated for the rights to revert to you, and they are now in your hands, no longer in the hands of Wesleyan. So any further translation of the work would have to come directly to you. And I think that's an important thing to leave people with, actually, because indeed we could talk all afternoon. And I think if we need to have another conversation, we can absolutely do that. But I think that artists need to be reminded as well that if there isn't a reversion rights in your contract, there probably should be. And that even where there isn't, in a situation where, particularly where, in poetry, ironically, this is not unusual for a book to only go so far. And the publisher is more than willing to have you take the book off their hands. Because time passes. I would really like to see the end of contracts in perpetuity myself. I find that I think the whole notion of in perpetuity is abusive. So I find
it's almost like a sentence, isn't it? For getting life.
It is 1:44. Now, I did have one other thing I wanted to leave us with. I wanted to read from this, if that's okay. The Notanda is an extraordinary piece of work in its own right. If I may.
Yes, you may. But can I just say a couple of things, Martha, before you do that? And I know we're wrapping up.
I wanted to say something, but I don't think I'll have the time. Go ahead.
One, very quickly. Faisal, the person I've mentioned who says that he doesn't think it can be translated, believes that the Notanda should be translated. So I just wanted to say that to you, Martha, that he feels very strongly that the Notanda should be translated. I think it's only fair that I should mention that Wesleyan have changed their position on letting authors know about when rights are sold, and they also have increased the base fee that they're paying. Benway only paid $150 for the rights to do this. Wesleyan has now increased that to, I think, a minimum $500 for under 1,000 copies. So I think it's only fair to say that. And one last very, very quick question, going to something you said, Martha, about the positionality and the Stéphane raised as well. I got a recent query about translating the last section. And I won't mention who from and so on, but the person who is querying wants to, they are writing about cemeteries and the dead and so on, and they think that the Ebora section really fits in with this and so on. And I read it and I thought to myself, no, you don't get, this is not about putrefaction. This is not about ghosts and duppies, And so I think that really elaborates what you're talking about the importance of when people come to this work. Let me end with this. What I learned from this text was how I had to put my ego out of commission. The text taught me humility. I did not want a white male European voice in this text, but the way the text was telling me it had to be written, the voice remained. The gift at the end is that voice, that person jumps overboard and symbolizes the death of a system for something new to get born. If I were writing it in the same way I usually wrote, which is like, I want this there, I don't want this there. So what I've noticed is that there's a lack of humility with people Europeans by and large, who've approached this text. There's not a willingness to put the ego out of commission, which I think, let me say, is a lifelong task for writers. That's what we have to do. Two works always, the work I want to write and the work that has to write itself through me. And that's where I would end this. Thank you. Thank you so much, Martha, for allowing me.
So incredible. So much gratitude for the work, for your time to talk about this chapter in your life. Please, to the ancestors, all of our ancestors, for carrying us into the future from the past.
Thank you.
So with that, thank you so much, Stéphane, for taking time out of your day to participate in this with us. Thank you, nourbeSe, for the work.
Thank you.
Thank you, the audience, for joining us. Thank you, Diane Roberts, wherever you are in the beautiful world, for introducing us. And take this out into the world, my friends. We must resist.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stéphane. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you. It was
Be well and enjoy.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.